September 15, 1940, 11:06 a.m., as sunlight flickered through thin layers of battle smoke drifting across southern England, and the clipped, anxious voices inside RAF Fighter Command crackled with warnings that came a heartbeat too late, the fate of Britain hung by a thread. Radar towers had detected a massive incoming formation, but the blips on the screens appeared so suddenly, so close, that even hardened operators hesitated, staring at the ghostly shapes that were moving toward a critical RAF sector station faster than any previous raid. Biggin Hill was already battered from earlier attacks. Kenley had been hammered for days. And now Northolt, a key fighter base in the chain that shielded London, lay directly in the path of a formation big enough to rip the heart out of fighter command if left unchallenged. Officers rushed to calculate interception times, but every sweep of the radar arms confirmed the same terrifying reality. No squadron was close enough, except one. Number 303 Polish Squadron. The foreigners. The men who had escaped burning Warsaw, fought in France, trained in Britain with barely understandable English, and were now, through a twist of fate and geography, the only pilots standing between Britain and disaster. Their flight leader, the fierce and sharp-eyed Witold Urbanowicz, received the alert with no hesitation, no pause, no question. "Wings up," he ordered in a voice that sliced through the sunlight-soaked airfield, and the Poles sprinted toward their hurricanes with the urgency of men who knew that every sound in the distance might be the last thing their adopted homeland ever heard. Mechanics leapt aside as engines burst alive, coughing, roaring, trembling with the raw power of the Merlin engines that had become the beating heart of Britain's survival. The Poles did not wait for perfect formation. They did not wait for measured instructions. They did not wait for the British controllers, who were still calculating grid positions and scrambling to understand how many enemy aircraft were on the way. They simply took off. Wheels up, noses pointed toward the sun, the hurricanes clawed into the sky like arrows fired from a bow, and as they rose, they could already see them, specks of black against the brilliance of the late morning light, dots that grew rapidly into the unmistakable silhouettes of Heinkel 111s escorted by tight groups of Messerschmitt Bf 109s sweeping ahead like wolves guarding a pack. Britain had seen these raids for weeks, but much about this one was different. This formation was larger, tighter, flying lower, and pointed directly at a sector station whose destruction would blind fighter command in one quadrant of southern England. Urbanowicz pushed his throttle forward and felt the hurricane surge, the engine screaming as if it too understood the stakes. The Poles climbed without formation finesse, driven not by rigid discipline but by something far more primal, a desire to strike back at an enemy that had taken their homeland, burned their cities, murdered their families. They were not fighting only for Britain. They were fighting for Warsaw, for dignity, for revenge. Beneath the boiling clouds, the Heinkels continued advancing in a disciplined, methodical block, dark crosses on silver wings, bomb bay doors locked shut until release. Their escort fighters, sleek and deadly, swept back and forth, ready to pounce on any RAF squadron that dared climb into their gun sights. They had no idea the Poles were already coming. Number 303 Squadron reached attack altitude in a blur of speed, and before the British controllers could even finish relaying target vectors, Urbanowicz and his wingmen saw the perfect angle. They were approaching from above and behind the bomber formation, the sun at their backs, the perfect predator's position. British doctrine emphasized coordinated attacks, breaking enemy formations systematically. The Poles ignored all of that. Urbanowicz gave a short, sharp command in Polish, "Attack now," and dove with the fury of a man who had waited too long to taste vengeance. Hurricanes howled downward, rolling into the dive with wings trembling under the strain, and in seconds the air filled with the thunder of machine guns ripping through the quiet morning sky. Tracer rounds sliced through the sunlight like burning needles, and the first Heinkel in the bomber box erupted in flames, its engines coughing black smoke before bursting into a cloud of fire that spilled from its wings like molten gold. It fell instantly, trailing smoke downward in a long, deadly spiral. The formation convulsed in shock. Gunners scrambled, but the Poles were already on them again. Within seconds, two more Heinkels were hit, one losing an engine and wobbling as if drunk, another shuddering as its wing tore apart under the pounding fire of a hurricane diving so close that the Polish pilot later said he could see the terrified faces inside the bomber's cockpit as he pulled past. Urbanowicz' men did not break off after one pass. They attacked again and again, slashing through the formation with brutal precision and savage speed. British ground controllers could hardly believe the reports coming in, enemy bombers falling in rapid succession, each claimed by the same squadron. The Germans were stunned. They had expected resistance, but not this, a squadron that attacked with the ferocity of a storm and the recklessness of men who felt no fear at all. The escorting Bf-109s dove to engage, scrambling to protect the burning bombers, but the Poles were already everywhere, climbing, diving, striking from impossible angles. A Messerschmitt latched onto the tail of one Hurricane, firing bursts that stitched dangerously close, but Sergeant Joseph Frantisek, the wildest and most unpredictable ace in the squadron, swooped in from above with a scream of his engine, firing a burst that cut the German fighter in half. The wreckage tumbled into the clouds. In the control room at RAF Uxbridge, commanders stared at the situation map as markers representing German aircraft vanished one after another. "Who is engaging them?" one officer demanded. The answer came seconds later. 303 Squadron, sir. The Poles. The room fell silent for a beat. Everyone knew they were good. They just didn't know they were this good. Within 4 minutes, the outcome of the entire engagement had changed. 4 minutes that altered the trajectory of the Luftwaffe attack. 4 minutes that prevented a sector station from being obliterated. 4 minutes that saved the critical RAF command network from collapse. The bombers, now bleeding smoke and missing half their protective escort, panicked. The tight German formation disintegrated as pilots jettisoned bombs early, scattering them over fields instead of the airfield. Others turned for France, engines burning or sputtering. Urbanowicz pulled his Hurricane upward, scanning for another target, but the air was already filled with falling debris and the streaks of retreating aircraft. The Poles had broken the raid, shattered it, ripped it apart faster than any British commander could have imagined. On the ground, British soldiers and civilians watched the sky in awe as burning German aircraft fell like meteors, their destruction so sudden it seemed unreal. "Who are those pilots?" a sergeant asked, shielding his eyes. "Poles," another replied. "The Devil Squadron." Above them, the Hurricanes reformed, wings wobbling slightly from the stress of combat, engines roaring with victorious fatigue. They had done in minutes what entire wings struggled to achieve in hours. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. The British controllers, in disbelief, sent a single message to the squadron as they returned to base. "Well done. Britain thanks you." But the Poles said nothing. They simply circled downward, landing with shaking hands and eyes still burning with adrenaline, knowing that these 4 minutes would echo not only across Britain, but across the entire war. And as the Hurricanes rolled to a stop, Urbanowicz removed his goggles and whispered, not in triumph, but in quiet defiance, "For Poland." September 15, 1940, 11:27 a.m. crept toward noon, and the English countryside trembled again as the sky filled with smoke trails twisting like tangled wires across the blue, and No. 303 Squadron, their aircraft still vibrating from the fury of their first strike, climbed back into the thinning cloud layer, each pilot scanning wildly for the next target. Because although the German formation had been shattered in under 4 minutes, the battle was far from over. New clusters of Heinkels and Dorniers pushed through the haze further east, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109s that dove aggressively to clear the path for their bombers, and the Poles understood instantly that their mission wasn't finished. They had bought Britain minutes, not safety, and those minutes were already melting away like frost beneath a rising sun. In the operations room below, radar screens flickered with updated blips, the telltale pulse of incoming aircraft shifting direction, altitude, and strength, and controllers barked rapid commands into telephone headsets, directing units still airborne to converge on the threat, but few were close enough to intercept in time. Fuel was low, pilots were exhausted, and the Poles, still burning with adrenaline, demanded permission to re-engage, even though they were the only squadron that had already thrown itself head-first into combat twice that morning. Permission was granted. At 11:29 a.m., the Poles banked east into the path of the second wave, sunlight glinting off their canopies as if blessing them, and they dove once more with the same terrifying intensity that had stunned the Luftwaffe moments earlier. Below them, the German pilots, still reeling from the unexpected ferocity of the first attack, spotted fresh contrails streaking downward and realized with dread that the same squadron, the one they had nicknamed Die Teufel, was barreling toward them yet again. Lieutenant Miroslav Ferrick led the charge this time, his engine screaming as he throttled forward, and he locked onto a Heinkel at the edge of the bomber formation, squeezing off a short burst that stitched across its fuselage and sent the aircraft wobbling sideways, trailing dark smoke as its crew panicked and attempted to stabilize it, but the damage was catastrophic. The bomber spiraled away, disappearing into clouds below. Right behind him, Sergeant Joseph Frantisek dove so steeply that his wings shuddered under the strain, the altimeter spinning dangerously downward as he cut across the German escort screen, forcing several Messerschmitts to break formation, and he snapped onto the tail of the nearest one, firing so close that shell casings bounced off his own wings as the German fighter erupted into flames. The escorting Bf-109s scrambled to reorganize, trying to bring order to the chaos that the Poles had once again unleashed, yet the 303 pilots moved with a kind of instinctive harmony, a deadly dance built from training, rage, and a deep desire to prove themselves in a war they had lost once already in their homeland. Meanwhile, on the ground, air raid sirens wailed across potential target cities, though none knew which one had been chosen for destruction. Civilians huddled in shelters, unaware that far above them, a handful of foreign pilots were fighting to protect skies that weren't even their own, skies they defended because the fall of Britain meant the death of hope for Poland as well. At 11:35 a.m., the second German wave began to falter, not because of British reinforcements, which were still minutes away, but because the Polish squadron fought with such blistering violence that the German formation couldn't maintain coherence. Bombers began turning prematurely, dropping payloads into empty fields, jettisoning bombs to lighten their load, anything to escape the relentless assault from these pilots, who attacked as if fueled by something more powerful than gasoline. Then came the moment that shook even the Poles. A third wave appeared on radar. Controllers could scarcely believe it. 3 full-strength attacks in under an hour. Hitler had emptied his aerial reserves for what he believed would be the decisive strike against RAF Fighter Command. At 11:41 a.m., No. 303 Squadron received the order to disengage and return to base for refueling, ammunition, and rest. But their radios crackled with protest. They could see the third wave already approaching, still distant but closing fast, and their instincts screamed at them to stay, to fight, to stop the Germans before they reached inland cities already stretched thin by the day's fighting. But regulations were strict. Pilots with dangerously low fuel risked not only their own deaths but the loss of their aircraft, and 303 had already run their engines to the edge of mechanical tolerance. Still, before turning away, they executed one final maneuver, a high-speed pass to disrupt the German formation's approach vector. It worked. The bombers scattered slightly, just enough to slow their advance, and those precious seconds allowed distant RAF squadrons, previously too far to help, to finally scramble and climb toward the incoming threat. At 11:48 a.m., the Poles broke off and headed home, their aircraft battered, their fuel gauges nearly empty, their ammunition belts stripped bare, but their presence in the battle still lingered like an electric charge in the air, because the Germans, shaken for the first time that day, had begun to realize the truth. Britain was not protected by a broken, exhausted air force. It was protected by warriors who refused to die. At 12:06 p.m., the Poles landed one by one, wheels slamming onto the runway with the weight of victory and exhaustion combined. Ground crews sprinted to their aircraft, refueling tanks, rearming guns, checking for hidden damage, while pilots stumbled from their cockpits drenched in sweat, their hands trembling with adrenaline. But there was no time for rest. Enemy aircraft was still inbound, and London, Southern Command, and multiple RAF stations remained vulnerable. As squadron leaders gathered around a hastily drawn board, tracing the updated radar plots with chalk-stained fingers, they understood the stakes. Their actions in the next hour could determine whether Britain survived the day. And above them all, somewhere in the endless sky, the third wave of the Luftwaffe approached, larger, heavier, and angrier than the waves before it, determined to break a nation's spirit. But they had no idea that the men waiting for them on the ground were the same men who had torn apart the first wave in 4 minutes flat. The Devil Squadron was preparing to rise again. September 15, 1940, 12:14 p.m., the sun hung high and merciless, burning through patches of thinning cloud as RAF ground crews swarmed around the hurricanes of No. 303 Squadron like ants rebuilding after a storm, their faces streaked with sweat and grease, their hands moving with mechanical precision as ammunition belts were fed into gun bays, fuel hoses hissed, and wrenches clattered against steel panels. Every second mattered, because far above, the third wave of the Luftwaffe advanced. Like a migrating thunderstorm, thick and heavy with the promise of devastation, and the Poles, now standing beside their aircraft, could feel the deep rumble of the incoming engines vibrating in their chests even before the sky revealed them. The air smelled of fuel, hot metal, and distant smoke drifting from earlier battles, and the pilots, though exhausted, felt a familiar tightening in their stomachs. The silent acknowledgement that they had already fought once, and then twice, and now would have to rise a third time against an enemy with numbers far greater than their own. At 12:17 p.m., Squadron leader Witold Urbanowicz approached the pilots gathered beneath the wing of his Hurricane, his face stern but burning with a fierce determination. He spoke quickly, concisely, outlining their orders: intercept the third wave, disrupt the bombers, break their formation, and buy time. Time for other RAF squadrons still climbing to reach the fight, time for London to brace for impact, time for fighter command to breathe. The Poles nodded without question. They all understood that their earlier success had already tipped the scale of the battle, but this next engagement could determine whether the Luftwaffe gained control of the skies or suffered its most humiliating defeat. For Britain, this was not merely another raid. It was the climax of the Battle of Britain Day, though none of the men standing on the grass field could know that future historians would call it so. Engines roared to life at 12:19 p.m., propellers chopping the air with violent force as hurricanes shuddered forward. The vibrations rattled through the pilots' boots, climbing up their spines as the aircraft accelerated across the field. One after another, No. 303 Squadron lifted from the ground, wheels folding into the underside of their wings as they climbed steeply toward the dark smudge appearing in the sky to the southeast, the unmistakable mass of dozens of bombers flying in tight formation, their silver fuselages catching sunlight like rows of distant lanterns. Behind them and above them, their escorts, Bf 109s, streaked across the sky in neat, disciplined waves. By 12:24 p.m., the Poles had gained altitude and formed a defensive wedge, though their earlier combats had taken a toll. Some aircraft vibrated more than usual, a few engines coughed at high throttle, and several pilots nursed minor injuries from shrapnel, loose canopy fragments, or the brutal strain of high-G maneuvers, but still they pressed on. The London skyline flickered beneath them, its rooftops glimmering faintly in the midday light, unaware of the storm preparing to break overhead. And then the moment came. The bombers grew large enough to see the markings on their wings, the black crosses painted boldly across metal that seemed to stretch endlessly across the sky. Urbanowicz barked the order over the radio: 303, attack! The Poles dove as one, their hurricanes slicing through sunlight like blades, and the Luftwaffe escorts scrambled into position to stop them. With a crack of gunfire, the third clash of the day erupted, louder and larger than the previous two. German fighters swooped into the path of the Poles, their engines screaming as dogfights exploded in every direction, spirals of smoke twisting from damaged aircraft. Sergeant Frantisek, flying slightly ahead of the others, pulled into a steep climb, then flipped into a diving turn that placed him behind a Bf-109. His guns erupted in a brief, blistering burst. The German fighter shuddered as sparks erupted from its fuselage, then plunged toward the sea trailing black smoke. But the bombers kept coming. Slow, heavy, relentless. Like iron giants trudging through the sky, they pressed forward despite the chaos swirling around them. The Poles tore into the formation, flying so close that the slipstream buffeted them like waves against cliffs. A Heinkel tried to evade Urbanowicz's attack, banking hard left, but the Polish commander matched its movement perfectly, firing burst after burst until smoke poured from its engines and the bomber lurched downward, its crew scrambling for parachutes. At 12:33 p.m., the battle over southern England became a storm of contrails, flames, and descending aircraft. British observers on the ground stared upward, shielding their eyes from the sun as they watched Hurricanes and Messerschmitts twisting together like tangled birds. The roar of engines carried for miles, echoing across fields, villages, and churchyards. Explosions dotted the sky. Trails of smoke cascaded downward like black ribbons marking the path of falling machines. Yet even as they fought with ferocious determination, the Poles faced a grim reality. Their ammunition was disappearing fast. Several pilots, after firing their last rounds, had to break away, their guns silent but their aircraft still valuable distractions as they dove through the formation to draw enemy fire. Others shouted warnings over the radio. Enemy fighters closing in, bombers nearing their release points, escorts numbering too many to count. Then something unexpected happened. At 12:41 p.m., additional RAF squadrons finally reached altitude. Spitfires from No. 92 Squadron appeared out of the sun, diving into the flank of the German escorts, their sleek silhouettes flashing past the Poles like predatory birds entering the feast. Hurricanes from No. 253 Squadron rose from the west, firing into the bombers that had slipped past earlier attacks. The result was instant, devastating, and deeply demoralizing for the Luftwaffe. Their carefully constructed formation shattered like glass. Bombers scattered, fighters broke ranks, and confusion erupted across German radio channels. Some pilots begged for orders, others shouted warnings, and many simply dove downward, desperate to escape the tightening jaws of the RAF trap. For the first time that day, the Poles could breathe, not with relief, but with renewed purpose. Reinforcements had arrived. Britain was not alone in the sky anymore. But the battle was not yet over. At 12:48 p.m., a cluster of bombers, around 10 Heinkels, broke through the defensive screen and raced toward London, their payloads still intact. Urbanowicz spotted them immediately and turned what remained of his squadron in pursuit, though their numbers had dwindled sharply. Only a handful of 303 Hurricanes still had enough ammunition to make a difference. They dove once more. A Polakowski burst through the formation from below, firing upward into the belly of a bomber until flames exploded from its center. A second bomber tried to climb, but Ferrick intercepted it, peppering its wings with rounds until one engine burst apart and the bomber spiraled downward like a crippled bird. The remaining bombers panicked, dropping their payloads too early, watching bombs fall harmlessly into open fields instead of the city they had been meant to destroy. At 12:53 p.m., the last major German wave broke apart completely, retreating across the Channel in disorganized clusters. No. 303 Squadron, smoke-streaked, bullet-riddled, and running on fumes, circled above southern England, watching the sky slowly empty of German aircraft. The roar of engines began to fade. The dogfights dimmed. The afternoon light softened, and silence slowly reclaimed the heavens. The Poles descended toward their airfield at 12:58 p.m., exhausted beyond measure, yet filled with a fierce, burning pride. They had fought 3 battles in one day, harder battles than many pilots faced in a week. They had fired until their guns ran dry, climbed until their engines groaned, dove until gravity dragged tears from their eyes. And they had survived. But more importantly, they had saved Britain. Or at least, they had bought it enough time to save itself. And though they did not yet know it, the day's battle would be remembered not for its statistics, but for its heart, the moment when foreign pilots flew as if defending their own homeland, and in doing so became legends. September 15, 1940, 1:12 p.m., the airfield around RF Northolt trembled with the vibrations of returning engines as the hurricanes of No. 303 Squadron descended in ragged formation, their fuselages scarred, their canopies streaked with smoke, their propellers visibly chipped from debris sucked in during the chaos of combat, and as they touched down, ground crews sprinted across the tarmac with tools, extinguishers, and replacement parts, shouting over the din as pilots climbed out of their cockpits, their faces pale but glowing with the adrenaline of survival. Yet even as they staggered toward the dispersal hut, they knew the day was not finished, not by a long shot, for intelligence officers hurried toward them carrying fresh radar prints and updated intercept orders, their expressions tight, urgent, the faces of men who knew another wave could appear at any moment. The Battle of Britain was not a neat sequence of engagements, not a single clash but a rolling, unpredictable storm that could surge again without warning, and though Fighter Command believed the Luftwaffe had spent much of its strength in the enormous earlier raids, caution remained absolute. After all, Hitler had thrown everything at Britain today, and pride could still demand one final strike before daylight faded. Inside the operations hut, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Chalkboards covered in grid maps filled the walls, and exhausted controllers scribbled updates as fresh reports came in from the coast. Scattered Luftwaffe survivors retreating across the channel, isolated groups of fighters regrouping, bombers still damaged and limping home, no sign of a coordinated fourth wave. Yet the Poles, sipping weak tea and running trembling hands through their sweat-soaked hair, felt the lingering dread of uncertainty twist in their stomachs, because the sky outside was deceptively quiet, and quiet in wartime could be a warning just as easily as a blessing. Urbanowicz paced slowly behind them, still in his flight suit, eyes narrowed with the focus of a man who knew that commanders could not afford even a moment of rest. He replayed the battle in his mind, analyzing their maneuvers, their losses, their fuel consumption, their ammunition discipline, planning adjustments not for today's fight, because today was already nearly decided, but for the battles tomorrow and the day after, when fatigue, attrition, and constant tension threatened to erode even the strongest pilot's edge. At 1:26 p.m., a radar operator burst into the hut, breathless, waving a fresh report. Unidentified dots rising near Cap Gris-Nez, speed and altitude inconsistent with bombers, more like fighters, possibly reconnaissance or a probing force. Instantly, the mood shifted. Chairs scraped against the floor. Pilots set their cups down and stood, minds already preparing for another scramble. But the controllers watched the radar trace carefully, calculating, interpreting, and after 5 long minutes confirmed the new contacts were withdrawing, not advancing. They were simply late-returning German fighters straggling home from the earlier waves. A sigh rippled through the room, though none of the Poles allowed their shoulders to fully relax. They were warriors in the middle of the most critical air campaign in history, and they had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself politely. At 1:34 p.m., ground crews reported half the squadron's aircraft operational. The other half required longer repairs, bullet-punched wings, damaged tail sections, oil leaks, ruptured hydraulics. Yet the Poles insisted on helping the crews, lowering themselves beneath the wings to tighten bolts, patch holes with tape and canvas, refill cooling systems, even wipe the soot from gun barrels. They worked quickly, silently, methodically, men too tired to speak, too determined to stop. For them, this wasn't merely Britain's war. This was revenge for Warsaw, for their homeland crushed under German boots, for the friends and families they had lost when their country fell. Every minute spent repairing a hurricane was a minute invested in the future of Europe. By 1:48 p.m., the pilots gathered outside again, watching the sky. The clouds had begun to thicken, drifting low and heavy across the horizon, casting moving shadows across the airfield. Distant rumblings of artillery like thunder echoed from the east. Perhaps weather, perhaps the remnants of battle still unfolding miles away. František stood with his hands behind his back, gazing upward in silence, as though challenging the heavens to send one more test his way. Ferenc scribbled notes in a small booklet he carried everywhere, documenting kills, aircraft behavior, fuel consumption, maneuvers that worked and those that nearly got him killed. Other pilots leaned against sandbags or sat on ammunition crates, heads resting against their knees in momentary micro-rests that lasted seconds at a time. At 2:02 p.m., an RAF intelligence officer arrived with preliminary analysis of the morning's clashes, and the room hushed as he spoke. The Luftwaffe losses were severe, far beyond their expectations. Dozens of bombers down, many fighters destroyed, entire formations broken. If the numbers held true, today might mark the turning point, the moment when Germany realized the skies over Britain were not theirs to claim. The Poles exchanged glances, not of triumph but of quiet, controlled satisfaction. They had been part of that turning point, perhaps the critical part. The 303 Squadron had destroyed more aircraft in a single day than many entire wings had managed over weeks. They had saved bases, cities, lives. But more than that, they had struck fear into the hearts of German pilots. Yet, as the reports continued, the mood darkened. Losses were not one-sided. Other RAF units had suffered. Several squadrons were nearly depleted. Airfields had been damaged. Civilians had been killed in scattered bombings. The cost of victory was always high. Urbanowicz absorbed this information silently, his jaw tightening. He knew they would fight again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Britain's survival depended not on one victory, but on endurance. At 2:19 p.m., the radio crackled to life. Fighter command to all stations. No further raids detected. Stand by for additional updates. Maintain readiness. Readiness. A word that carried weight like armor. It meant, rest if you can, repair if you must, but understand the fight is not finished. Not today. Not ever. The Poles returned to their aircraft, running final checks, tightening straps, cleaning windscreens. The sun dipped behind a growing bank of clouds, casting the field into a muted grey. A wind began picking up, cold and sharp, cutting through their flight suits. For a moment, the sky was completely still. No distant engines, no shifting contrails, no thunder of bombs. Only the faint hum of wind across the grass. At 2:32 p.m., orders arrived from headquarters. No. 303 Squadron was to remain on high alert, but would not be scrambled again unless radar detected a major formation. This was the closest thing to rest they would receive today. Some pilots sat on the steps of their aircraft and allowed their eyes to close, not sleeping, simply drifting. Others walked the perimeter of the field, breathing in the cold, metallic air to stay awake. Ground crew members brought blankets, water, and small tins of ration biscuits, and the pilots ate them mechanically, barely tasting the food. Then, at 2:47 p.m., the clouds parted briefly and sunlight fell on the airfield again, illuminating the worn faces of the men who had saved Britain hours earlier. After everything they had endured today, they finally had a moment to breathe. Not safely, not fully, but enough to remember that they were human. At 3:01 p.m., a young British mechanic approached František with a trembling smile, saying quietly, "Sir, you saved us today." František looked at the boy. He couldn't have been older than 19, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We saved each other." And that was the truth of the Battle of Britain. It wasn't won by one squadron, one pilot, or one nation. It was won by 1,000 threads woven together, radar operators, ground crews, pilots from 12 countries, commanders, civilians, all fighting in their own way. But the Poles, especially No. 303 Squadron, had shown something exceptional that day. Speed, courage, ferocity, precision. They had proven that even in the darkest hour, unexpected heroes could rise, and foreign wings could defend a British sky. By 3:18 p.m., as the afternoon stretched onward and the clouds thickened once more, the men of No. 303 Squadron remained ready, engines cooled, guns rearmed, hearts steady. The Luftwaffe might return. Hitler's pride might demand one more strike. And if it came, the Poles would be the first to rise again. For in the quiet between storms, they understood something deeply. Today they had saved Britain. But tomorrow, they might have to save it again. September 15, 1940, 3:27 p.m., the afternoon light dimmed once more as thick grey clouds drifted across the sky above RF Northolt, casting long shadows over the dispersal huts and parked hurricanes, their metal skins still warm from the earlier battles, and although No. 303 Squadron remained on high alert, the momentary lull in the fighting created an eerie quiet that felt more like the stillness before a storm than the end of one. The pilots sensed it in their bones, the way seasoned. Soldiers do when instinct warns that a day's struggle has not yet fully revealed its final twist. Air raid sirens in nearby towns had fallen silent, replaced by the distant hum of traffic as civilians cautiously climbed out of shelters, unaware that high above them, the Poles sat ready in their cockpits or paced the grass with slow, methodical steps, listening for the faintest hint of incoming engines. At 3:41 p.m., the operations room received another radar sweep. No major formations detected, but scattered German aircraft still dotted the channel, some returning home, some circling as if lost, and some, likely reconnaissance units, lingering just beyond range to assess the damage wrought upon Britain. Yet the controllers issued no new scramble orders, allowing the Poles to remain grounded for the moment, though grounded was a misleading word, because the minds of the pilots were not at rest. They replayed every dogfight, every turn, every burst of gunfire, every time they glanced down and saw burning aircraft spiraling into the sea below, their nerves still vibrating with the echoes of combat. At 3:55 p.m., the squadron gathered in the briefing hut as a senior intelligence officer delivered the first formal update of the day. He spoke with measured precision, tapping a pointer against a large map of southern England as he outlined the path of each of the three major German raids, identifying which formations had been broken and where, confirming that the Luftwaffe had launched one of the largest coordinated assaults of the entire war, an operation fueled by Göring's personal conviction that Britain could be crushed in a single decisive blow. But instead of victory, the Germans had found themselves outmaneuvered, outcoordinated, and most importantly, outfought by a combination of radar precision, rapid RAF deployment, and the unexpected ferocity of the foreign pilots who filled Britain's ranks. The officer paused when discussing No. 303 Squadron specifically, acknowledging in a solemn voice that the Poles had not merely participated in the battle, they had shaped it. Their speed, accuracy, and relentless aggression had disrupted the Luftwaffe's timing, fractured its formations, and created openings that allowed other squadrons to catch up and overwhelm the Germans. For a brief moment, silence fell across the hut, not the silence of fatigue, but of recognition, of shared understanding that today would be remembered. But as the sun dipped lower and the light outside turned amber, the weight of the day began settling on the men like invisible lead. They drifted outside again, some leaning against their aircraft, others walking along the runway to stretch stiff muscles. The adrenaline that had carried them through wave after wave of combat now evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache in their chests and limbs. They had lost friends in other squadrons. They had witnessed explosions in the distance, some in the sky, some on the ground, each one a reminder that victory was never clean, never simple, never without cost. Yet their spirits did not fracture. If anything, they hardened, fusing resolve with pride. For fighters who had lost their homeland, every German loss felt like restoring a fragment of what had been taken from them. But even in that pride, they understood the truth. Britain was now their battlefield, their refuge, their mission. At 4:22 p.m., the sky briefly brightened, and a warm glow fell across the airfield. The Poles watched as a lone Spitfire with engine troubles limped back to base, landing awkwardly but safely, prompting ground crew to cheer and run forward to help the pilot. Such small victories mattered. They were reminders that even on the heaviest days, survival was worth applauding. But moments later, the deep droning hum of engines echoed faintly from the south, and every head snapped upward. For an instant, tension electrified the air again. Was this a fourth wave, a surprise attack, a final push from a desperate Luftwaffe? Pilots scrambled toward their aircraft, hands already gripping cockpit frames. But then the sound faded. Not bombers, not fighters, just a civilian convoy on a coastal road, engines reverberating strangely through low clouds. A collective exhale washed across the field. The men returned to their seats, some chuckling at their own instinctive reaction. A fighter pilot learns never to trust silence. By 4:38 p.m., ground crews delivered updates. Several damaged Hurricanes would need overnight repairs, one would likely never fly again, and another, Frantisek's aircraft, required a careful engine inspection. Frantisek brushed off the concern, claiming the plane just needed a little more Polish discipline, earning a rare laugh from the exhausted men around him. Yet beneath the humor lay an unspoken truth. Any machine could be replaced. A pilot could not. And today they had come dangerously close to losing several. At 4:53 p.m., Urbanowicz called a brief squadron meeting outside, the men forming a loose circle beneath the lengthening shadow of a hangar. His voice carried the calm authority of a commander who understood both the weight of the day and the character of the men he led. He reminded them that their victory today, though extraordinary, did not end the war. The Luftwaffe would return. Germany would not accept defeat easily, and Britain still depended on them. His words were simple, direct, but struck with the force of truth. The pilots nodded in solemn agreement. They were ready. They would always be ready. And though tired, bruised, and tangled in sweat-stiff uniforms, they stood tall, the afternoon light catching the metal eagles pinned to their jackets, symbols of an air force that no longer had a nation, but still had a purpose. At 5:12 p.m., the first confirmed casualty report arrived from Fighter Command. Many RAF pilots had died in the morning's battles. Some were friends the Poles had trained alongside. Others were men they had never met but felt connected to through shared sky and shared risk. The news fell like a shadow across the squadron. A few pilots turned away, staring silently at a distant line of trees. Others clenched their fists, jaws tight. Loss was part of war, but the sorrow of losing the defenders of a free world struck deeply. Yet even in grief, determination grew stronger. By 5:27 p.m., the sun lowered enough to cast long golden beams across the runway. The air cooled. A breeze rustled the grass. Pilots walked individually or in small groups, some heading toward the mess hall for a lukewarm meal, others lingering near their aircraft, as if unwilling to leave the machines that had protected them only hours earlier. Ferrick sat on the wing of his Hurricane, writing quietly in his notebook again. When asked what he recorded, he replied without looking up. Proof. Proof that we were here. Proof that Poland still fights. His voice was steady, but the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. At 5:42 p.m., the operations radio crackled softly. Status update from Fighter Command. No further major raids expected. Luftwaffe withdrawing from the day's operations. Stand down to readiness level 2. Stand down. The words washed over the squadron like a gentle wave. They had won the day. Truly, decisively, undeniably. They had stopped the largest German air attack yet launched against Britain, prevented catastrophic damage, and shifted the momentum of the entire battle. And though they had fought as foreigners, they were now part of Britain's story, woven into the fabric of its survival. As dusk approached, The Poles gathered along the edge of the runway, watching red streaks of sunlight melt into the horizon. It was the first peaceful moment they had shared since sunrise. The sky above, earlier filled with smoke and fire, now stretched quiet and vast, painted with colors soft enough to almost hide the scars of war. For a moment, the pilots said nothing. They simply breathed. They listened. They felt the fading warmth of the sun on their tired faces. But even in peace, they knew tomorrow would come. And when it did, they would rise again. For Britain. For Poland. For the skies that still needed defending. September 15, 1940, 6:11 p.m., as the last edge of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon and a copper glow faded into the gathering dusk, RF Northolt fell into a silence so profound it felt almost sacred, a silence earned through fire and fear and the unmistakable weight of victory, for though the day had begun with the roar of engines and the thunder of battle, it now ended with nothing more than the distant chirp of evening birds and the soft creak of cooling aircraft resting on their wheels after hours of punishment in the sky. The men of No. 303 Squadron, faces smeared with oil, uniforms stained with sweat, arms aching from the strain of combat maneuvers, stood scattered across the field like weary guardians at the gates of a nation that had barely survived the storm, and as the sky darkened, they felt the exhaustion of a day that had taken years off their lives, yet also something else, something harder to describe, the first hint that the tide of the Battle of Britain had shifted, that Germany's aura of invincibility had cracked, and that a small group of foreign pilots, fighting for a homeland they had lost, had played a decisive role in the survival of a country that had adopted them not by choice, but by necessity. In the softening twilight, the familiar sound of ground crew rolling fuel tanks and tool carts echoed gently across the field, accompanied by occasional laughter, a sign that adrenaline was finally dissolving into relief, and the Polish pilots, slowly drifting toward the mess hall, were met with spontaneous applause from British mechanics who, despite their reserved nature, understood better than anyone what the Poles had accomplished that day, cheering them with a sincerity usually reserved for legends rather than men, and even the most hardened Polish aces felt their throats tighten at the unexpected recognition. Inside the dimly lit dining hall, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of tea brewing in industrial kettles, and pilots from various squadrons gathered around long wooden tables, trading stories of dogfights, near misses, and the strange flashes of detail that one remembers even in lethal chaos, cloud shapes, sunlight catching a bullet casing, the way a Messerschmitt's wingtip shimmered just before it snapped away under machine gun fire. The Poles spoke rapidly in their own language, their voices rising and falling with emotion, their hands gesturing wildly at moments of triumph or terror, while British pilots leaned in, smiling, not understanding every word but knowing exactly what the emotions meant, because the language of survival in the sky required no translation. At 7:04 p.m., Squadron Leader Kent visited their table, clapping Urbanowicz on the shoulder and offering heartfelt praise, reminding the Poles that Fighter Command had taken notice of their extraordinary performance and that official reports already listed No. 303 as the highest-scoring squadron of the day. For a moment, pride flickered in their eyes, not vanity, but the deep pride of men who had fought for months to prove they belonged in the sky, that they were not refugees or relics of a conquered country but warriors whose skills had been forged in battles far older and far harder than the war now raging above Britain. Yet even amid celebration, the Poles felt a chill in their hearts, a reminder that victory did not erase loss, and when word arrived that several RAF squadrons had suffered heavy casualties earlier in the day, the room fell into a heavy silence as pilots bowed their heads in quiet respect, some pressing their fingers against the wooden table as if grounding themselves against grief, each man aware that tomorrow's lists could include a friend, a mentor, or themselves. At 7:42 p.m., the pilots stepped back outside, the night now fully settled, the first stars emerging, faint and fragile against the backdrop of war, and the air carried the distant echo of anti-aircraft guns from London where fires still burned from the bombing, their glow faintly visible on the horizon, a reminder that the Luftwaffe could still strike, that today's victory was only one chapter in a much longer struggle. The Poles stared toward that faint orange flicker, fists clenched, knowing that families were hiding in shelters, counting on men like them to hold the line. As they walked along the runway toward their quarters, the Hurricanes stood in neat rows behind them, dark silhouettes under the moonlight, their wings patched, their fuselages scratched, but still proud, still ready, and for a moment the pilots paused, gazing at the machines that had kept them alive. Planes built by British factories but made legendary by Polish hands, machines that seemed to embody the spirit of two nations fighting as one. At 8:19 p.m., Urbanowicz dismissed the men to rest, insisting they get sleep while God still allows it. But few followed his advice immediately. Some lingered alone, replaying the day in their minds, haunted by vivid flashes of combat, the dizzying climbs, the screams of engines pushed beyond their limits, the sudden eruptions of flame when a cannon shell found its mark, and above all the chilling memory of watching enemy aircraft fall, each one carrying a life, a young man perhaps not so, different from themselves, driven by duty, belief, or simply obedience. War had hardened them, but not enough to silence conscience completely. At 8:47 p.m., as a thin mist drifted across the field, Jan Zumbach walked the perimeter of the base, boots crunching softly on gravel, hands deep in his pockets, feeling the cold seep into his bones. He had fought in Poland, escaped across Europe, flown in France, and now defended a foreign island with the same intensity he had once reserved for his homeland, and though he felt pride for what they had done today, he also felt a heavy sorrow, because victory here did not restore Poland, did not drive out the invaders who had shattered his life, did not erase the memories of friends killed in Warsaw's skies. The British celebrated the day as a triumph. The Poles celebrated it as revenge, but revenge was a poor substitute for freedom. Closer to the barracks, Joseph František stood beside his Hurricane, touching the cooling metal of the fuselage as if speaking to an old friend, whispering to it in Polish, telling it they would fight again tomorrow, telling it that they would not falter, telling it that fear had no place in the cockpit. He had lived through chaos most men could not imagine, flown more missions than anyone could count, and he bore the war lightly, recklessly, dangerously, as though already convinced that fate had granted him borrowed time, and he intended to spend it all in the sky. At 9:13 p.m., the officer's hut received the final official dispatch from Fighter Command. The Luftwaffe had suffered catastrophic losses. Britain had held. Today's battle would be remembered. When the message was read aloud, a quiet ripple passed through the pilots. Not cheers now, but something deeper, a recognition that they had witnessed a turning point, a moment historians would one day describe in books, documentaries, and memorials. And yet, the Poles remained humble, for they knew better than anyone that war was not won in a single day. Germany would attack again. The skies would burn again, and they would rise again. At 9:51 p.m., the men finally entered their quarters, collapsing onto bunks, stripping off flight boots, rubbing their eyes, muscles trembling with exhaustion. But just as sleep began creeping in, a distant rumble echoed through the night, an explosion somewhere over London, and though it was far away, every pilot froze for a moment, listening, their hearts tightening. The Blitz was not over. The danger had not passed. But tonight, at least, Britain still breathed. At 10:17 p.m., the squadron drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams tangled with smoke trails and tracer rounds, the mind struggling to process a day lived entirely at the edge of death and triumph. And outside, under the moonlit sky, the Hurricanes stood silently in the cool night air, their shadows long on the grass, their engines resting, waiting, ready to roar back to life at dawn. For the battle was not finished. The war was not won. But because of 4 minutes, 4 impossible, ferocious minutes flown by men who had lost everything except courage, Britain had been given a future. And in that future, every breath of freedom, every dawn untouched by tyranny, carried the echo of Polish voices shouting through the radio in thick accents. 303 ready. We attack. For minutes had saved a nation. For minutes had rewritten history. And the world would never forget the day foreign pilots fought like lions and kept the skies of Britain free. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.